On the surface, the west coast of Vancouver Island is an untamed shore, pounded by the world's largest ocean. But below the surface, it's fragile, mysterious, an alien world shaped by the tides and teeming with secrets we've yet to fully understand. Of all the creatures who call this place home, the sea otter has had the largest impact on the richest ecosystem on Earth. But today, this ancient, unassuming animal is immersed in a controversial battle for the riches of the sea with the world's most dangerous predator, man. The sea otter has danced on this aquatic stage almost since life began, but now it's been forced to dance to a new tune in the modern world. British Columbia first meets the power of the Pacific Ocean on the 400-kilometer-long west coast of Vancouver Island. On the island's isolated northwest coast live less than 5,000 people, about 300 of those in Cayucit, a small outport accessible only by boat or float plane. My name's Chris Harvey Clark. I'm a marine biologist and veterinarian, and I've spent most of my life underwater. I got my first good look at sea otters in 1989, trying to help them during the Exxon Valdez oil spill. It isn't one of my fondest memories. This is my first trip to Cayucit, but I'd known for a long time that it was a very special place. I wanted to see for myself how our own sea otter population was doing, but my first encounter wasn't exactly what I'd expected.
What's the story of this little guy here?
Well, he was found on the beach by a native called Oscar, and so this is little Oscar.
Little Oscar.
This is Oscar, baby.
Baby sea otter.
Yeah.
Cayucit is a Nootka word that means place of many winds. But inside its harbor, you hardly notice the blow, making it an ideal haven for people and for sea otters. Sea otters once thrived from California to Siberia, but were hunted to near extinction in the 19th century. In Canada, the last one was shot right here in Cayucit in 1929. About 30 years ago, 140 Alaskan otters were reintroduced in these same waters. The sea otter is a member of the weasel family, and although its hind feet have evolved into flippers, the forepaws still have the dexterity of their land-based cousins. This comes in handy to rip apart tough shellfish, which feeds its insatiable appetite.
This guy we're following seems to be a bit of a crab specialist in this current sweat narrows here. This is a shell from a red rock crab, and he's got a consistent pattern. He pulls the legs off, sucks the flesh from those, pulls out the body, and discards the shell.
The sea otter is an evolutionary marvel. They're the ultimate aquatic harvesters, perfectly adapted for life on the edge of the sea. Everything they need is right here in places I couldn't wait to explore. There's a local saying that spending one day in Cayucet is like a year in any other place. And they're right. This is one of the most beautiful places in the world. It's ironic how important the sea otter is in West Coast history. Captain James Cook first sailed into these waters in 1778. He left with otter pelts, which he sold for a huge profit in China. It wasn't long before Russian fur traders also came looking for otter pelts, which they called soft gold. By 1910, less than 1,000 sea otters were left from an original population of over 250,000. In Canada, they were completely wiped out. I'm heading for the Bunsby Islands, about 10 kilometers north of Cayucet, with my guide John Mooney, who knows these waters well. The Bunsbys are where sea otters were reintroduced in the 1970s. These islands provided a combination of exposed shores, sheltered bays, and shallow water, all of it teeming with life. As far as Canada is concerned, this is the heart of sea otter country. There could be as many as 300 animals in the area around Cayucet and the Bunsbys. But whatever the numbers, they still occupy a tiny part of the West Coast. Diving in the Pacific Northwest, the first thing you notice is the incredible nutrient density of the shallow inshore water. Offshore currents dredge up a ton of nutrition from the seafloor, which reacts with sunlight. The result is a fabulous bouillabaisse of life, maybe the richest there is on Earth. Life began in the sea, and the incredible biodiversity of basic life forms down here far exceeds anything you'll find on land. For me, there's no other place I'd rather be. We don't know why, but about 7 million years ago, ancestral land otters made an about-face and returned to the sea. It probably stuck its toe in while foraging for mussels and urchins along the shore at low tide. From there, it must have been easy to finally dive right in. I've spent my whole life swimming with sea creatures, and to observe but not disturb sea otters, I brought along the otter can.
We seem to have a small electrical problem.
Saran Classic. This is the original Saran wrap. It is not a cheap imitation.
Just outside Cayucet's harbor, a shoal called Chief Rock is home to the largest otter raft on the coast. Sea otters have got great vision and sense of smell, but are very slow swimmers, making them easy prey for orca or sharks. So they're very skittish.
We can't get the camera deployed close enough to the animals, and they spook when we get too close, but they don't mind it when speedboats pass 15 feet away at 30 knots. So we're gonna do a moderate speed pass and try and put the otter cam in the water, drop it as we go by. Here we come.
The receiver transmitter on the back there is like a sail, and it's slowly moving in.
Otters in a raft will do things we usually only see in social primates, like grooming each other, playing together, and engaging in mock battles. Otters are always on the go, and for good reasons. Unlike all other sea mammals, they have no blubber. Instead, they have a magical fur coat. A human head has about 100,000 hairs. An otter has about 800 million to keep its body warm and amazingly waterproof.
These are animals that spend a substantial portion of everyday grooming because with no blubber, they've got to keep that coat intact. Usually we'll start with very vigorous rolling in the water, which is called pinwheel rolling or barrel rolling. And as they're doing that, they've got their nose down here and their paws like this, and they're blowing, and what they're doing is blowing air right into the coat as they do that.
It's the same as wearing a down jacket. Trapped air in the underfur keeps the skin warm. And, with a little fluffing, it becomes an inflatable life raft. Wherever there's an otter raft, right next door you'll find a kelp forest. Sea otters love kelp. They feed in it, sleep in it, and give birth in it. I've even seen injured otters rubbing themselves with kelp poultices. Kelp is the largest aquatic plant in the world and can grow 2 feet a day to nearly 130 feet in height. Down here is the sea otter's pantry. You'll find crabs and snails clinging to the strands, while abalone and urchins feed on bits of floating kelp. The return of the sea otter to British Columbia has been a spectacular success, and for the past 30 years, the population's been growing by about 10% a year. The major reason is this underwater habitat. Sea otters make the most of living in the sea, but they are the smallest of all sea mammals. And even with its magical fur coat, they need to burn a lot of energy to stay warm. An adult male needs to eat about 9,000 pounds of food a year. That's the equivalent of me eating 100 hamburgers a day. To help harvest all that food, sea otters are the only mammals other than primates to use tools. Clams are tough even for a diver to dislodge, but after a few good whacks with a homemade hammer, there's nothing these innovative creatures can't eat. Some otters will adopt a favorite tool and carry it in a pouch under their arm. There's even been a few cases of otters using bottles to crack open shellfish.
There's certainly otter predation going on here. There are no urchins, really. You find them back in crevices and cracks past about 60 feet. There are rock scallops all along here, but most of them have been taken. No abalone at all, but certainly the readily accessible prey species like sea urchins have been just about completely extirpated from this site.
With so many sea otters around, it's hard to believe they're still a very endangered species. It's also hard to believe that Cayucit itself was once a thriving fishing port, full of trollers. But life's changed dramatically here since the commercial salmon fishery collapsed.
Well, this here was a fishing village. At one point we used to have, I guess about 23, 24 trollers around here years ago, in my younger days. And just within the last maybe 15 years, like it's dwindled right down to maybe only one now, maybe two if we're lucky. I just sold my license because there's no fish out there for me to do, no fishing.
For the Nuchalnuth First Nation, the erosion of their traditional way of life has created a lot of stress in the community, and it seems on the resources they have left.
Well, we all ate the seafoods out here. We used to have sea urchins, abalone. Like all of those are all cleaned right out now because we don't get them here anymore.
With their insatiable appetites, it's not surprising sea otters conflict with humans. But it must be even tougher to deal with when the competition is living right in your own front yard.
Well, the otters have, there used to be quite a bit of otters right down here within the last maybe 3 or 4 years. I didn't realize what they were doing until we went down there one day. It had been going, disappearing slowly. There's nothing there, nothing left there now. What we have to do is go around and search for our seafoods now. We have to go miles sometimes to get what we want. Places where the otters haven't raided yet.
The story in Cayucot isn't new, it's just a new version. For over a century, the Nuchalnuth had a monopoly on the sea's resources and probably hadn't planned on sharing them with the sea otter ever again. Like all of the Pacific Northwest First Nations, the Nuchalnuth have lived here on the land and lived from the sea for thousands of years. But living in this isolated part of the world doesn't mean that the modern world isn't accessible or welcome. I'd planned to spend most of my time in the natural world, but I wanted to know a little more about how people in Cayucot felt about their new neighbor. Hilda Hansen has seen a lot of local history come and go, but like most of her people, she only remembers seeing the otters come and her traditional food sources go.
We're missing our food that we had out there. All the crabs, clams, they're all gone. Abalone. Nobody finds any abalone around now where we used to get them, just go out there and get them. We're hungry for them.
Al Vincent is the band's fishery manager and advises the community on how to manage their local resources. His problem isn't with the otter, but why they were reintroduced here in the first place.
Nobody seems to know how to manage things. Like when the sea otters were first introduced here, we didn't know anything about it. Nobody told us. We just heard that they were here. They were planted here. Nobody informed us about it.
It's not hard to understand the local anger. After 100 years of no sea otters, they're suddenly popping up everywhere. Around here, they call it the raccoon of the sea, and a lot of band members are losing patience with this new and unwelcome competition.
Well, everybody's talking about that, and you should do something about them and try to get rid of them, or ask somebody to help us to get rid of them, because we like our seafood and we have no more.
Well, we're going to find some way to control it, get rid of some of them. I don't know how. Get rid of most of them, at least half at least. Even that would be too much, I don't know. Sure, doing a terrible impact on our foods.
Getting rid of one of the world's most endangered animals is a real modern paradox. On the whole west coast, there's only 2,000 otters, but in Cayucot, there's an epidemic. Sea otters are a protected animal species in Canada, and harassing or killing one can bring a fine or a prison sentence. But there are no fisheries officers patrolling around Chief Rock, and almost none at all along the entire 400 kilometers of Vancouver Island's west coast. I started to hear stories about powerboats driving through otter rafts at top speed, and it wasn't to take a shortcut home.
I think some people are angry, you know. It's pretty sad because I work for the fisheries program for our tribe here, and I travel out in the waters quite a lot every day, and I'm starting to see sea otters with a bullet wound and it's drifting around dead. I think that's how some of the people are feeling already. I don't know who's doing it, but we've seen them. I've seen two in Glenelg, and I've seen two in up the inlet here not too long, a couple of weeks ago.
The people of Cayucit had given me a brand new perspective on West Coast living. I'd come here to see the otter back in its natural place in the ecosystem after an unnatural 100-year absence. But what a difference that century has made. After it was removed from the ecosystem, a lot of other species flourished. And 30 years ago, when it was reintroduced, there was no commercial demand for foods the otter eats, like abalone, urchins, or clams. In the New World, it appears that the otter is a rather bad fit. Humans see it as a biological vacuum cleaner. Yet in nature, it's still the key intertidal predator that cements the integrity of the entire ecosystem. The sea otter is doing well in its own world, but all is not well in Otterland. More than the people who live here, the Pacific Ocean defines British Columbia. It creates the weather that shapes the province's ecosystems, the storms that put the rain on the coastal rainforests and powder snow on the mountains. On the surface at least, nature, as we understand it, prevails. But hidden below and invisible to most of us, the sea otter is intimately connected with the undersea ecosystem in ways we're not even close to understanding. Removed from the otter raft and the conflict between man and otter is the estuary that nourishes the rich intertidal community, bringing nutrients down from the mountain streams to the ocean. It's an indication of the interconnectedness of this system. The health of this salmon river is mirrored in the health of the surrounding waters.
The wonderful thing about this type of environment is the mixing of salt and fresh water that's going on. You can see it in the water right around me here. There's this sort of swirly, almost like icicle effect on the surface of the water. And this is because salt water is denser than fresh water and it's inverting. And of course, when the tide comes in, it replenishes that. When the tide goes out, it changes the pressure and the salt water comes out and mixes with the fresh water. Well, this is good for marine organisms and especially young and larval forms. Like that lower salinity, it's a more gentle environment for them as they grow up.
And when they do grow up, they leave, heading out to where fresh water finally gives way to ocean currents. Like its rainforest cousin, the shallow intertidal ecosystem depends on three things: water, light, and nutrients. But typical of its own alien nature, life is inspired here by more heavenly bodies. The timeless shifting of the tide has been the pulse of this place for millions of years. The pull of gravity from the moon and sun forces the surface of the ocean to move perpetually, day in and day out. Around Cayucit exists some of the highest tides in the world, rising and falling 3 to 5 meters. Under this tidal influence, many of our toughest, most resilient life forms have evolved. Twice a day, these creatures are submerged in water that's only 3 or 4 degrees. And then twice more, they're baked at temperatures of up to 40 degrees Celsius in pools left behind by the receding tide. Peering into a tide pool, and the microcosmic universe you find there is like visiting another planet. Here, all creatures are interdependent, linked together in a colorful, comical, and sometimes lethal cycle of eat and be eaten, just the way nature had planned it. There's constant activity, most of it imperceptible to the naked eye, but nothing stays the same here for more than a few seconds.
This is a small example of one of the largest starfish in the world. Pycnopodia have been found up to 2 meters across. That's this big. And these animals are very capable predators. They can overtake and eat just about anything they find in a tide pool. Even very fast-moving animals like crabs, when they're moribund, can be overtaken by Pycnopodia. And they're also very patient. They'll sit and they'll use these tube feet to pull apart bivalves. They'll extrude their stomach right inside the shell of a bivalve to digest it. So a phenomenal predator here in the form of Pycnopodia.
It's a pretty harsh world, everything feeding on everything else. And the ecosystem's most important animal is its most voracious predator, stuck in an evolutionary rut, eating 1/4 of its body weight a day.
We've got this guy, very nonchalant otter, who's eating away like crazy here. He's just stuffing his face.
If all an otter seems to do is take from the ecosystem, leaving nothing but carcasses behind, millions of years of evolution tell another story. Marine plants form the first building blocks of food chains in the ocean. Microscopic plants, in turn being eaten by microscopic animals, in turn being eaten by larger invertebrates and fish. This hierarchy of feeding works its way up to bigger fish, birds, mammals, and eventually the large apex predators. Unlike orca or sharks, the sea otter is not an apex predator. But it is the key predator, holding the balance of power by eating the predators of kelp, which in turn makes it the keystone species of the whole ecosystem. Remove it, and the structure collapses. Without the sea otter, kelp predators like sea urchins, abalone, and turban snails literally mow the kelp down. So many animals and organisms rely on kelp as their breeding and feeding habitat that, just like clear-cutting a forest, its loss has a devastating effect on biodiversity. Its loss also affects the total amount of biomass produced by the ocean, because many other key species, like Pacific herring, will only spawn on the leaves of kelp plants. Sea otters have wisely chosen to be creatures of the shallow subtidal zone. Even with a set of huge lungs, their diving limit is about 70 meters, or 6 minutes without surfacing. But within those 70 meters thrives the richest ecosystem on our planet. The sea otter has been the keystone of the subtidal ecosystem for millions of years, and man and otter have coexisted here for thousands of years. So I guess the real question is, what's changed? Down here, not much. But on the surface, commerce drove the sea otter to extinction, and now it's driving boats right over top of them.
It's just amazing. A lot has been eaten here. Pretty well all the large invertebrates you find are gone. I found one abalone. It was way back in a crack where even smart little paws couldn't get it out.
It's hard to imagine what Cayucot was like a century ago. The people who live here seem to like it a lot better today, or at least they did until the sea otter reinvaded their territory. It's a fact the otter is having an impact on local fishermen. It's also true that the island coastline is slowly returning to the way it once was. But which way is the right way? Nature the way it was, or the way it is now? Like everyone, I had a pretty short-term view of coastal ecology, since it's really only about 150 years old. Jane Watson doesn't. She's been coming here to Cayucot to study the complex interaction between the sea otter and the kelp forest for over 20 years. Almost from the time the sea otter was reintroduced, Jane's had a good long look at the way things were and the way they are for both the otter and the people who live here.
When sea otters were in the ecosystem prior to being hunted to extinction, they probably controlled the abundance of most invertebrate prey subtidally, so below the intertidal zone. When we removed those sea otters from the ecosystem, many species of invertebrate flourished. Basically, you'd taken the predator away and they became what can only be described as superabundant. And that superabundance, of course, has led to the development, along with commercial interests, of commercial shellfish fisheries. So we now have fisheries for species of invertebrates subtidally that could never have existed had the sea otter not been originally removed.
With the loss of the sea otter from the ecosystem, a brand new economic and ecological regime on the coast was established, which still exists today. If you think about it, most of the marine life on this coast probably evolved in a kelp forest. With the otter gone, evolution was turned upside down, controlled by a new but equally voracious predator. The red urchin is a favorite food of sea otters. It's also the major marine invertebrate that shapes the current ecological makeup of the Pacific shallows. That's because they're large-scale grazers that can devour whole forests of kelp. Today, the entire outer coast is dominated by the uncontrolled spread of urchins. Otters are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. As voracious as they are, they're also very responsible ecosystem managers. And it seems they're much better at it than we are. When otters move into an area, they'll only take the large urchins, leaving the smaller ones tucked away in crevices they can't reach. You still have urchins, but a lot less urchins. And then you end up with kelp, the glue that holds the entire ecosystem together. The only problem with sea otters, like nature itself, is you can't have it both ways, especially in the modern world.
Well, sea otters get blamed for the demise of species, but I always like to point out that sea otters do not drive species extinct, because at some point it becomes not worthwhile for an otter to harvest animals that are no longer available. They're not going to go looking for the last urchin or the last abalone. They're going to eat something that has some benefit to them. There's a huge difference between a human harvester and an animal that is harvesting. Generally speaking, for humans, as a species becomes less and less abundant, it becomes more and more economically valuable. So it becomes more worthwhile to exploit the last few of those individuals. And on this coast, we have an excellent example of that. It's the abalone. Abalone fishing in British Columbia, both commercial and recreational, was shut down in 1990, and it had nothing whatsoever to do with sea otters.
Another good example is the sea otter himself. The last few otter pelts probably sold for a bundle back in the late 1920s. But now that they're back and well established at least locally, the sea otters come back with a vengeance. Kelp forests around Cayucot, like the one at Chief Rock and further out in the Bunsby Islands, have increased dramatically, providing food, shelter, and new spawning grounds for fish. Nobody knows how long it will take before real beneficial effects are seen in terms of improved fisheries for species like herring or improved biodiversity. But if you compare the abundance of fish in kelp forests to areas dominated by urchins, you'll find between 40 and 50 times more fish in kelp. The sea otter's doing its bit and putting a lot of overtime in too. But otters, unlike people, don't wear watches. And I'm not sure if we have the patience to wait.
I don't know why all the native boats were heading out this morning, other than
Weather is something no one around here will dare to predict, but rain or shine, there is one sure thing. At Chief Rock, the otter raft is always there. And as usual, they hardly notice us as we drive by, heading back to the Bunsby Islands. The amazing thing about the Pacific coast is the abundance of wild foodstuffs and raw materials humans need to easily survive here.
Wow, dense bush here.
It's the richness of this nurturing environment that allowed the Nuchalnath and the rest of the coastal First Nations to worry less about food and spend more time developing sophisticated cultures with unique art and legends. The combination of lush rainforest and a rich ocean allowed for the creation of the greatest non-agricultural based civilization in the world. The sea otter wasn't really a part of the animal lore of the ancient Northwest, and I've often wondered why that was, because they must have been everywhere. But they never lived right on top of people, and otters were probably controlled by the mere presence of hundreds of communities just like Cayucot, most of which are now long gone. Back in the 1970s, no one asked the otters if they wanted to be relocated. No one asked the people either. Since then, reintroduction has become a great success story, except right here in Cayucot.
I never ever thought about it until my daughter, she's 12 years old, she came up to me about a year and a half ago. She said, "Dad, I don't like the sea otters anymore." I said, "Why?" "Well, I know I'm supposed to be eating sea urchins and abalone and clams." She said, "But I've never tasted it." To me, that says quite a bit. It says a lot.
It's a testament to how small the world has become, when even in this resource-rich place, there may not be enough food to go around.
Well, there's 3,000 of them here, but there's only 400 of us left, right? We're historically a pretty monstrous nation, but not no more.
Our population was about 5,000 to 10,000 in this area. Cayucot alone.
The entire community agrees there needs to be a solution before the problem gets out of control.
I went out actually with a couple of my friends a few years ago, and I'm like, "What are you guys doing?" They pull out this little 22 and they start shooting at the otters. It's like, I thought it was mean, but after I thought about it, it's like they're taking a lot of our seafood, that their population needs to be controlled right now, I think.
Control is something I heard a lot about in Cayucot. The loss of the commercial fishery has created real stress out here, and there's now a strong desire to control what's left of their traditional way of life. Today, what nature once provided in infinite numbers can only be found in a fish farm. There's more spring salmon in this one farm than caught off the entire North Island. But unlike the commercial fishery, fish farming is year-round employment, something else that's extremely rare these days. Another growth industry in the area is ecotourism, and despite its remoteness, people from around the world are coming here to experience nature in the raw and the rare endangered sea otter. But like me, they'll never see it the way it's supposed to be, and probably won't realize they haven't. If the sea otter has been returned to an unnatural world, other marine species likewise live in that same world, and the impacts on all of them are profound. Orca rarely feed on otters, but up in Alaska, orca are having a major impact on sea otter populations because of a decline in seals and sea lions, which we think is due to a decline in fish stocks. Otters here worry more about eagles plucking them out of the water, but orca predation is becoming more common, making the otters more skittish than they already are. But predators are not a threat to the survival of sea otters on the BC coast. That threat still comes from man. Just over the horizon, 800 oil tankers a year pass Vancouver Island on the Alaska run. I worked with sea otters during the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And the thing that still drives home is that as soon as the animals are contaminated, it's really too late. Even a small amount of oil will destroy the insulating capacity of their fur. In the Valdez disaster, thousands of otters died, and there was nothing we could do about it. With otters here concentrated in just a few areas, a single accident would be catastrophic. And not just to otters or the ecosystem, but to an entire way of life. Sea otters around here are harvesting prey like clams now, which take a lot of energy to collect. It's a sign they may be starting to outstrip their local food resources, which will force some of this population to expand. Some think they'll move down the coast towards central Vancouver Island and the lucrative crab fishery in that area. If that happens, it's a good bet the conflict that exists here in Cayucit will escalate rapidly. For both otters and man, it's a turbulent new world. And as stewards of our planet's resources, it's up to us to decide whether we want to coexist with animals like the sea otter. Animals which eat the things we like to eat and interfere with the way we think things ought to be. But if the sea otter does rejuvenate this complex ecosystem and make it a viable place for all of us, it will prove just how fragile nature can be and how only nature can repair itself.
There's a killer in the ocean. It is the wolf of the seas. It hunts in packs, feasting on seals and whales. The killer whale. One of its favorite hunting grounds is the entire west coast of North America. These hunters have no enemies, but it now appears that they are at risk of becoming extinct before the end of the 21st century. The clue to their fate is new. The appearance of friendly orphans, and it's an ominous sign that this is a killer in peril. A city is no place for a killer whale. But in January of 2002, 5 kilometers from Seattle, Washington, a young orca is sighted in Puget Sound. It seems to be about 2 years old, only a baby. The orca, or killer whales as they're commonly known, virtually never travel alone. This 570-kilogram baby is in a dangerous place, swimming in heavy boat and ferry traffic. Ken Balcom, a well-known whale biologist in the Seattle area, is one of the first on the scene to investigate.
This is a whale that had the great potential for just bonding to a human. If you were there, she'd come to you. You could slap the water, she'd slap her flipper. You could say roll over, she'd roll over.
But no one knows where this killer whale came from, or why she is alone. Balcom has been keeping track of the orcas in these waters for 27 years. He knows every orca that lives here, but this one is a mystery. Somehow she's become separated from the rest of her family. First, Balcom needs to know where this lost young whale comes from. She could be from one of 3 very different populations of killer whales. One type are known as transients. These are the ocean's fiercest hunters, eating only marine mammals, including some species of whales. Transient killer whales travel up and down the Pacific coast of the United States and Canada. And there is one more possibility. These killer whales are called residents. They too travel up and down the coast, but return to the same feeding grounds every year. Through information gathered in Puget Sound, the baby is identified as Springer, a Canadian killer whale. Soon after, its identity is confirmed by Canada's leading killer whale experts. John Ford and Graham Ellis have been tracking and identifying orcas for over 30 years. Each year they head out into the Johnstone Strait to study killer whales.
This area right here in Johnstone Strait is probably the best easily accessible known location for viewing killer whales and studying them in the world. And as a result, most of what we know about killer whales scientifically has been learned with this population here and the sort of sister community, the southern residents off southern Vancouver Island.
Since 1973, these researchers have been taking mugshots of killer whales using dorsal fins to identify them. Dorsal fins are like fingerprints. Each fin has nicks and scrapes that are unique to each animal. Ellis and Ford's long-term killer whale study is probably the most detailed of its kind in the world. Ironically, killer whales aren't whales at all. They're dolphins, the largest of their kind. But they are deadly. They'll hunt fish, marine mammals, and even attack a bear or moose if it decides to swim too far from shore.
Just trying to see what groups are here. They're really spread out.
Who's that over there, Graham?
I think that's I-24 with their new calf and I-49, I believe.
This is A54 with her very first calf, and her mother, A30, grandmother's here as well. So you got 3 generations right here.
Killer whales travel in groups as large as 20 members. Ford and Ellis have discovered that each of these pods is actually an extended family.
Really, it took a number of years before it was clear that what we were dealing with here was a very unusual social system, strongly matrilineal in that every whale in the pod is actually descended from females in the group. So those big males are not the fathers of the offspring in the group. They're actually the grown-up sons of the mothers and the grandmothers in the group. They never leave the group. And this is what's so unusual about resident killer whales. It's a closed social system. The only way into one of these pods is to be born into it, and the only way out really is to die. I-33.
Yeah, she's surrounded.
Ford and Ellis know their killers well, and their expertise helped identify the mysterious orphan in Seattle.
It took some time to sleuth out exactly who it was, but it turned out it was a young 2-year-old whale from a pod that we know very well, and her sort of popular name is Springer. And so this young whale seemed to have become orphaned. We think her mother died, and in that process she became separated from the rest of the matriline, the rest of the pod, and wandered around until she ended up in Seattle Harbor.
The news spreads fast, and Springer becomes an instant celebrity, making headlines and the 6 o'clock news. Everyone, it seems, wants to know about this abandoned baby. Experts at the Vancouver Aquarium are called in to help. The American government asks for advice from veterinarian Dr. David Huff, who also has extensive experience with killer whales.
About every 3 weeks or so, we would go down and go out in one of their boats and just kind of hang out with her.
Dr. Huff suspects that Springer is sick. The clue is her breath. It has an acetone odor called ketosis.
When you got anywhere near the blow from her exhalation and sniffed it, it was like opening a can of paint thinner.
Springer's bad breath might be caused by consuming her own body fat to survive, a sign that she could be starving. In Seattle, the environmental groups Orca Conservancy and the Earth Island Institute find the money to finance a rescue mission.
We're dealing with a wild animal. She's never been restrained before. She will resist. That's her natural reaction.
Springer is about to make history for her species and our own. By May, about 4 months after being discovered swimming alone in Puget Sound, it's clear that Springer, the orphan killer whale, needs to be rescued. The problem is how. Jeff Foster, the world's leading expert on capturing killer whales in the wild, is called in to help. Foster brings his team to Seattle to plan their strategy.
When you're dealing with live animals, and you never know how they're going to respond, and so it's important to have contingency plans.
Foster's first idea is to lure Springer into a canvas sling. It's tricky, like convincing a whale to put on a raincoat, but it's the easiest way to get her into a boat. Plan B is a giant underwater pen that can hold Springer if she refuses to swim into the sling. The challenge here is convincing her to swim inside.
This will hang down. It's 30 feet deep. We have a lead line on the bottom that weighs approximately 100 pounds. Now, it's light enough that she can lift that lead line up if she does get into one of the corners, so she can still take her breaths and everything. But when you put this much net in the water, there is that concern of it catching the currents like a sail and the stuff bagging. So the way they designed the net and hung the net, it should hang fairly straight in the water if we're at slack tides.
It will take a small army of scientists and support boats to capture Springer, plus a lot of money. But why does this killer whale deserve the royal treatment? Part of the answer is that killer whales have become a Hollywood icon, and in the Pacific Northwest especially, they're public animal number one.
Once considered vermin on this coast, these animals are now icons of the Wild West Coast, and people come from around the world to see them. They live in societies that are complex, and we can actually relate to them as being highly social mammals ourselves, where their young animals are tended by the adults in the group, and they have these very cohesive societies.
To the public, Springer is a baby in trouble. To scientists, she's the future of a species in trouble.
Starting in the mid-90s, things started to change. The southern residents first peaked and then started on a declining trend. More recently, the northern residents seem to have gone on a similar declining trend. And so this has kind of triggered a few alarm bells. Why are their numbers going down?
The killer whales living near Seattle are in trouble. 20% have died in the last 10 years, leaving a mere 84 orca. The northern residents off Vancouver Island have 200 members, but their population too is declining. Orca breed slowly, and today's losses could signify the beginning of the end. Ken Balcom has been watching the southern residents closely, and he doesn't like what he sees. Using photo identification, he has constructed a family tree of the southern residents.
We put up all the living whales, their photographs are here. And all these other spots are little tombstones of whales that were alive during the study but have died. This is one little mature line that's totally dead. There's another mature line up here that only has the grandma surviving. All the youngsters are dead. So what this story is saying is that there's a very high mortality of young and middle-aged animals that should not be occurring. We have the older animals that are still here. Something happened that has reduced their fertility and their immune response. They're just dying.
Balcom's data shows clearly that young orca like Springer are dying far too often, and being alone doesn't help.
We realized Springer's long-term survival chances were very, very poor, and that likely we would need to intervene and get her out of that area back to Johnson Strait up in this area, where she might have a chance of reintegrating with her pod or related pod.
In British Columbia, Springer would find more food, cleaner water, and a chance to reunite with her family. But to get there now, she'll have to be captured, treated, and released. To do that, Jeff Foster needs to earn her trust. He makes many trips out to visit Springer. It's like a courtship. Foster wants her to get to know the team, as well as the ropes he'll be using. The team gives Springer back rubs and hang the stretcher in the water, hoping she'll get used to it. But time is running out.
She was going in smaller and smaller area around the ferries, and we all felt it was just a matter of time before she got run over and either killed or badly injured.
Game plan is just trying to get everybody out as close as we can, then we'll go over and interact with her, and then start moving everything into position if we can.
Now, 6 months after Springer was discovered, Foster and his team are told to capture the orphan killer whale. They try a test run first to see if she's ready.
It's a great day. We've been really lucky with the weather pattern this time of year. Usually in Seattle in June, you can never depend on it at all. Conditions are right. Really, the only thing that's working against us right now is our tidal action. We have some of the lowest tides of the year, so that's going to work a little bit against us.
Foster decides to use Plan B and attempt to lure the baby killer whale into the net enclosure. It appears that the team's courtship has worked. Springer happily swims up to the underwater cage, but the baby orca is playing hard to get. She takes a quick look around and then changes her mind.
Yeah, I'm very happy that 2 different occasions she swam in and actually into the enclosure itself. It would have been pretty easy to put a tail line on her, but that's okay. I think there was so much activity around. She did cooperate. She did go inside the enclosure, and then she lost interest and left.
It's a good start, but to save Springer's life, the rescue team will need to try again. And the sooner, the better. Springer has now been swimming alone in Washington's Puget Sound for at least 6 months. And the scientists here are keen to take her home to Canada. But why the rush? Puget Sound is already home to 84 killer whales. They eat the same food as Springer. Why not let them adopt this orphaned orca? The problem is that local killer whales will have nothing to do with Springer. And the reason? She has a foreign accent. No one understands killer whale communication better than John Ford. For 15 years, he's been studying their sophisticated, mysterious language. Ford is able to eavesdrop on the whales by dropping a special waterproof microphone into the ocean.
Goes down to perhaps 10 meters. Perhaps make a little recording here. Very distinctive dialect sounds of I-31 pod. And the animals are kind of scattered foraging. We're ahead of them, so we're detecting their high-pitched echolocation clicks. These sounds here, sort of popping sounds, they're clicks that they're using to navigate to find food.
Killer whales live in waters where visibility is often less than 7 meters. And so they use sound the way a bat does, as a kind of radar. They bounce their clicks off fish and rocks, listening to the echo to judge distance.
They also use a very complex set of very distinctive loud calls that are between 1 and 2 seconds long within the group and between groups to keep in touch. It seems each individual born to a group learns a repertoire of calls that is actually a sort of a vocal tradition in that lineage that allows it, it seems, to be part of that group.
This is where Springer learned her calls, from her own family called the A-pod. And she's still using their distinct dialect. It should help her family recognize Springer, if she can be returned north to these waters.
These dialects are very stable. Probably they outlive the actual individuals in the group, so I suspect that some of these major dialects have been around probably for decades, if not centuries, and are just simply passed on from generation to generation. Those kind of calls are very typical of their repertoire, their dialect.
Like humans, killer whales aren't born with their calls and have to learn them from their families. Killer whales can learn up to 12 distinct sounds unique to their pod. Springer had mastered them before she lost her mother and wandered into Puget Sound. But Springer's dialect is causing problems here in Washington. Local whales can tell she's a stranger just by the way she sounds. Her timing is terrible. This 2-year-old needs her family to teach her how to hunt for fish. Ironically, if she was much older, her dialect might attract a mate. Lance Barrett Leonard is a population geneticist at the Vancouver Aquarium. He has used John Ford's acoustic research to understand how dialects affect a killer whale's love life.
Neither males nor females leave their mothers, and so of course the obvious question is, are they inbred, and if not, how do they avoid inbreeding? This led me into a fairly extensive set of paternity tests.
DNA was collected from killer whales. The genes of the young were compared to genes of older males in the pods, and the results were striking. None of the older males were fathers of the calves. This proved that fathers are outsiders who don't live with the mothers or their children.
So although they spend their entire lives living in their natal pod, they don't breed within it. The fathers were always outside the pod. Resident killer whales are organized not only into pods but into clans, or acoustic clans, or language groups, dialect groups. And the fathers of calves are usually outside the dialect group or the clan.
Killer whales, it seems, use the equivalent of one-night stands to avoid incest, and fathers are always strangers, who sound very different from the pod. Females even choose elderly males so that their daughters can't mate with their fathers by mistake. For killer whales, this is the language of love. But for Springer, it may be years before her dialect attracts a mate, and right now, she needs human help simply to get home. In Seattle, Jeff Foster's team gets ready for a second rescue attempt. Once again, the team sets out to capture Springer, but this time, they'll use their hands. The ocean currents are too strong to use the net enclosure today.
There's always a potential danger jumping into the water with a large animal. These animals are very powerful. You don't know how they're going to respond when they're in that kind of situation.
If the plan works, It will be the first time a wild orca has ever been captured in order to be returned to the wild. Foster has been earning Springer's trust for weeks. Now it's time to put it to the test. The first step is to slip a noose around Springer's tail.
It was nerve-wracking. He had incredible patience and just waited for exactly the right time. I'm thinking, this isn't going to work today, this isn't going to work. And then all of a sudden, Jeff just slipped the noose over the tail, pulled on it, and it was amazing.
Once we had the tail line on her and we were able to cinch it up, then we knew that we had her under somewhat control. And then at that point, it's important to get in there and raise her head and get a hold of her pectoral fins and hang onto the dorsal, because they have a tendency to spin when they're in the tail loop, and get her up and make sure she has good solid breaths.
All she did was do a few little sort of tentative duck dive things with her head and slap her tail around a couple times.
More bodies, more people in the water.
Once we had control of the head, we brought other divers into the water to be able to manipulate her back into the stretcher.
This is the dangerous part. A thrashing 500-kilogram killer whale can easily break a diver's bones. Foster's team has come to expect it, but Springer puts up very little resistance.
Bradley called landing craft in. Yeah, they're on their way.
Surrounded on all sides, she allows the team to slip her into a stretcher. It's the beginning of the strangest ride of her young life.
Just a little bit, just replacement. Let's clear the belly strap. Yeah.
She is hoisted onto a barge that will be her home for the next hour. The first stage of Springer's journey home to her family in Canada is complete. But no one knows if they will accept her, or if she will be healthy enough to make the trip. After spending months all alone, 2-year-old Springer is now surrounded by doting adults. The orphan killer whale doesn't appear upset, and her human friends are thrilled.
Yeah, she was going like this, and I just didn't want to bump her with it.
Springer is on her way home, but she won't be going to Canada right away. First, she needs to be admitted to a unique animal hospital. Her speckled skin and low weight prove that she's sick and in need of treatment quickly.
This we're going to use to test all of her general health parameters, try to understand, one, how she's doing, and if she has any major medical problems, what we can do about it.
Springer's care is now in the hands of veterinarians from the United States and Canada.
We wanted to give her a clean bill of health and a health certificate. It was very important to check her to make sure that she wasn't going to bring any diseases back from Puget Sound to the whales in northern Vancouver Island and put her pod or other pods up north at risk.
It's extremely important to get a blood sample. We had to find out if she had any inborn errors of metabolism. Was there something inherent in her that would not make her one that we would want to return to her pod?
For the rescue team, Springer is a rare opportunity. For most of them, they're used to studying killer whales hands-on in aquariums or washed up dead on a beach. This is a chance to both study and cure a living wild killer whale. And Springer's been living in a dangerous place. Industrial chemicals have been pouring into the ocean here for decades. The situation has become so drastic that wildlife toxicologist Peter Ross was asked to investigate, and his findings are shocking.
The Pacific killer whales frequenting the waters off Vancouver, Victoria, Seattle are now considered the most contaminated marine mammals anywhere in the world. And when I say contaminated, I'm talking about PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. We tend to be concerned about these chemicals because they're very toxic. They tend to be very persistent. They're fat soluble, they bioaccumulate in food chains. They just don't disappear.
PCBs were banned in Canada and the United States over 20 years ago. But just as Peter Ross found, they didn't go away. They drift through the air and in the oceans and are still manufactured in Russia. PCBs collect in ocean sediment and are then gobbled up by fish. The salmon stocks of the Pacific coast are one of the primary food sources for resident killer whales like Springer, and they too contain PCBs and many other contaminants.
The whales are getting a double whammy here. They're at the top of the food chain, eating concentrated amounts of toxic prey, and they live a long time, and they're unable to offload it.
Males seem to have it worst. They spend their entire lives collecting and storing PCBs in their fat tissues. Females, however, can actually lose PCBs. The chemicals leave their bodies through the fat in breast milk and are passed on to their young. Springer was probably born with PCBs, and the fish she has been eating contain them too. Her low weight suggests that her body has survived by consuming body fat, a perfect way to release PCBs into the bloodstream.
We know that PCBs cause cancer. We know that PCBs affect the immune system. This means they're more vulnerable to disease. They may be more vulnerable to getting a cold or a little infection, or that cold might develop into a much more serious infection that they can't recover from.
No one knows why Springer's mother died, but she was part of a generation that came of age when PCBs were still being produced legally, and her death may have been caused by side effects of the chemical. PCBs are now one of the prime suspects in the deaths of American killer whales. With no natural enemies, most killer whales should die of old age. But the southern resident population here is down to just 84 members, and it seems to be both the young and the PCB generation that are dying the most. Springer's doctors aren't exactly sure why she's sick. It could be PCBs, even a genetic anomaly. They decide to run a series of tests, hoping that they can cure her and then send her home. For now, this holding pen is both home and hospital, although no one here is sure that she'll be a willing patient and remain inside.
Two riskiest aspects of the whole capture were when you first go in the water with her and try to control her head during the capture itself, and then also when we put her into an environment with walls, the net pen. We don't know how she's going to respond. If she wanted to and swam hard enough and fast enough, she could go punch right through the net. And she's from a three-dimensional world where she doesn't have really any barriers, and they don't know what to do when they come to a corner. A lot of times they can get their nose down into a net, or if the net isn't hung properly, they can get entangled in it very easily.
Springer has a good chance of recovering and ultimately returning to Canada to connect with her pod. But first, Springer's rescuers will have to practice a little whale medicine on a very sick child of the sea. Springer, the orphan killer whale, is now safe in a holding pen just outside of Seattle, Washington. Before she can return home to Canada, she needs a clean bill of health and a lot of help to get there. Dr. Peter Schrader is an American veterinarian, and it's his job to help Springer get better. The first challenge is her skin condition. Killer whales spend a lot of time rubbing against each other. It does feel good, but it's more than just a show of affection.
Her skin looked terrible. I've never seen skin like that on a cetacean. These animals are tremendously tactile. They're always rubbing against one another because under those layers of cells, marine algae can grow, fungus can grow, and these cells have to be sloughed off, which makes the skin healthy. Rubbing against another animal helps that process.
Springer has been alone for at least 6 months without any relatives to rub against. It's left her lonely and itchy. Dr. Schrader realizes that she needs something to rub against, and as often as possible. Fortunately, Springer provides her own inspiration. The team retrieves a stick she's been playing with in Puget Sound. A log is soon added. These whale toys work wonders.
Within probably an hour, she was doing barrel rolls and circles and basically quivering all over with joy. She could get a little push against this, which started to help her skin right away and help her psyche. I mean, she felt good doing that. I think it was obvious.
But Springer needs more than a log to make her feel better. She's underweight by at least 100 kilograms and needs to get her appetite back quickly. Dr. Schrader and his team want to help, but they know they can't get too close. If Springer gets used to human company, she may find it hard to return to the wild. The team decides to stay out of sight and use cameras to spy on their patient.
It's a remote monitoring system, so we can minimize our presence out around the pool side. And this is just a real handy way with a remote operated camera that can go anywhere on the pool, and we can monitor everything she's doing.
Springer gets fed using another kind of remote system. A 10-meter-long tube is designed to deliver live fish to the pen. A healthy killer whale will eat between 50 and 150 kilograms of fish a day. Springer is eating only 1 or 2 fish. Somehow, she's lost her appetite. Schrader first suspects that Springer's exposure to PCBs has compromised her immune system. But stool samples show exactly what is making her sick.
She had worms, and we know that worms will keep the immune status triggered. If the immune system is triggered long enough and often enough, it'll basically wear out over time.
Dr. Huff remains on site as the Canadian veterinarian. He and Dr. Schrader decide on a plan to get rid of Springer's worms.
Dr. Pete Schrader and I passed a stomach tube and put about 6 liters of water into her. And then we followed it up with a chaser of deworming medicine.
This worm medicine, which is the same kind of worm medicine that people use for cows and horses. It's not a special worm medicine for whales. 2 hours after that treatment, she started eating as if she finally realized that I have an appetite.
It was absolutely amazing. She ate so well that our concern then was not to overfeed her. So it was a remarkable turnaround.
It's in her mouth. Now it's gone.
After that, we could no longer smell the ketosis on her breath. The skin just started looking much, much better. And from that point on, we never again saw live worms in her stool.
For the first time in months, Springer appears happy and healthy. She's getting the strength she needs to return to the wild, and her recovery is just in time. Every July, her family returns to southern British Columbia to hunt salmon. Springer needs to find them within the next month. No one knows where killer whales go in the winter, so it's now or never.
We decided it would be prudent to give her some antibiotics to prevent any disease. This was a request by the Canadian veterinarian, Dr. Huff.
Dr. Schrader has the medication injected into fish, so he can be sure that Springer gets a full dose. Now the Canadian government can be confident that Springer won't be importing any diseases into her family's pod. After 1 month in Whale Hospital, Springer is finally ready to go home. Jeff Foster and his team return to load Springer onto a large catamaran that will take her north. Springer has gained weight, over 70 kilograms, and needs a crane to help her get on board. For some, it is a bittersweet moment. Dr. Schrader has spent a month with Springer, sleeping in a trailer next to her pen each night.
She wants to go home, and we're about to take her there. So it's with great joy, but a bit of not reluctance, but I guess poignancy that we get her to go back with her wild today. Kind of like turning loose one of your kids to college, I guess.
It is a 12-hour trip from Puget Sound to Vancouver Island. During the journey, Springer needs to be kept wet. She also needs to be acclimatized to her new environment.
All the way along, we were pumping in seawater and pumping out seawater so that by the time she got to Johnstone Strait, it wasn't as if she was changing from Puget Sound water to Johnstone Strait water. There was no sudden change in temperature, no sudden change in composition. There were no variables for her.
Springer's boat reaches the Canadian border and a country that is delighted to have her back.
Fisheries and Oceans Canada really would like to thank you and acknowledge the tremendous work that National Marine Fisheries Service has done, Jeff Foster and his team, and all the other organizations and individuals taking care of A73 and preparing her to come home on this journey. Canada has just an excellent team ready to take over and begin the next phase of this, which is bringing her home.
She's being ferried to the Johnstone Strait, home to 200 resident killer whales, including her own family. The orphan gets a hero's welcome from the local Aboriginal peoples. Where European culture has often feared and loathed killer whales, First Nations of the Pacific Northwest revere the killer whale as one of the guardians of the oceans. But Springer won't be rejoining her family right away. Jeff Foster and his team lower her into another holding pen. She needs to rest after her confusing high-speed journey north. Now there's only one challenge left: to reunite Springer with her family. No one is sure if this long-lost orphan will be accepted back into the pod. And the answer will surprise everyone. After being lost and alone for months, Springer, the orphan killer whale, is finally back in Canada. Her arrival home attracts a flood of attention from both the public and the media.
The whole Springer event was something that none of us had ever been through before. There was incredible interest in the whole operation, something that we've never seen, of course. And everybody was saying, okay, when are you going to let her go? You know, she's here now. And we had a number of criteria that had to be met, of course, in order to release her from the net pen.
Fortunately, the timing is good for a family reunion. Springer's family, the A-Pod, have returned to the Johnstone Strait for the annual salmon runs. John Ford and Graham Ellis have discovered that Springer's birth family has shrunk to only 3 members, including a grandmother and a great-aunt. This small group may not want Springer back after the death of her mother.
We didn't know whether this would work or not. It had never been attempted. This was really an experiment to see if this whale that had been out of its pod and any other kind of pod for at least 6 months, probably longer, would be accepted back into the group or would want to go back to the group.
The Canadian team decides to keep Springer in the pen for several weeks, giving her time to recover from her long boat trip north. It may also take time for any of her extended family to swim by.
Turned out she was vigorous. She was not fazed at all by the transport.
But what happens next surprises everyone.
That first night, whales came swimming by and there was clear acoustic exchanges between Springer and the whales.
She went wild. She got very excited into that pen, started to breach. And she was sort of screaming, calling out as loudly as she could and blowing our headphones off as we listened to her on the hydrophone.
She was very excited, pushing at the net. She wanted out.
The very next morning, Springer's pod arrives and seems to be waiting for the prodigal whale.
It was more than we could have possibly hoped for. It was amazing. We all looked at ourselves and said, is this really happening? Is it really this good?
The team knows they have to make a decision.
They're split into 2 groups. I want a one-word answer. Is it a go on their part? If it is, Lynn wants a one-word answer, yes or no.
It was nerve-wracking for me because all the capture team is in there holding her back, and the researchers are out a mile or 2 in the bay, and I'm trying to relay the message to them. But there really was no discussion. Everybody knew it was the best it was ever going to get.
We sort of did a quick vote over little walkie-talkies with all the various people who were involved, and I said, okay, let's do it.
Drop the net, open it up. It's being done now.
After at least 6 months away from her family, Springer takes her chance to go home.
Straight out and she's still under there. The net's open, she's out and she hasn't come up yet. It looks like she's heading straight out. She was typical Springer. She made a beeline for the whales, and when she got about 2/3 of the way there, went, oh, kelp. Let me play for a minute.
Root marks right off here. How far?
Ironically, Springer seems in no rush for a family reunion. She stops 30 meters away and keeps her distance. Then, the whales swim away from each other.
We thought, uh-oh, maybe she doesn't want to be a wild whale anymore. So the initial reaction on both parts was not very encouraging.
And the stakes are high. Springer is not the only killer whale who needs help. 500 kilometers away, on the northwestern tip of Vancouver Island, another baby killer whale has gotten lost. His name is Luna, and he hails from the toxic waters off Seattle. Luna is also rubbing up against boats and needs to find his own family.
We're not decided on what we should do about Luna down the road. We'll just have to, I think, continue assessing the success of the Springer operation to see whether it's worth trying a similar kind of thing with Luna. The southern residents really need him. They can't really spare any other animals. They're declining in numbers, and it'd be great to see him back into that population.
The Springer rescue is providing a reason for hope. 4 days after her release, she joins up with a 15-year-old female from a related pod. It seems that Springer has been adopted. The first time this behavior has ever been observed in the wild. For now, it's a good omen for lost or stranded killer whales in the future. And thanks to Springer, scientists now know that killer whales can be rescued and taken home. But the bigger problem is that home may not be a safe place for any killer whale. Noise pollution from boats can affect their navigation, and PCBs are already known to cause serious health problems.
We're going to be with this problem for a number of years. We should at least identify the root causes. We should hope that there is some potential good ending to all this.
When animals eat things that are toxic, that interfere with their hormones, that are different than what they've evolved with, it's going to have an effect on their reproductive rate. And that population is probably destined to become extinct unless there's going to be some major changes.
For the first time, scientists have rescued a stranded killer whale. They may need that skill in the years to come. The vast Pacific itself appears to be in a state of peril, and on the horizon there may be an epidemic of orphaned or stranded killer whales. Today, the ocean is not a safe place to be, especially for its mightiest and most magnificent hunter. Tugging constantly at man's spirit for adventure, the Arctic has challenged explorers for centuries. For most, the prize was the North Pole, but to get there, the journey often began here, on Ellesmere Island. This land of terrible beauty has lured many hardy souls seeking adventure, but who found only suffering or death. And it's been said that Ellesmere has the highest misery per visitor ratio in the world. One man knows the extreme allure of this island well. Jerry Kobalenko has walked more miles here than any living explorer. Defying the laws of the Arctic, he travels alone, following in the footsteps of the early explorers, learning from their mistakes and misery.
I think that the extremes are part of my attraction of travel here, because I do fairly well when the going is hard. I wouldn't define a love of extremes as a drug. It's just it's a home. And I think home is not where you live, it's where you belong.
We call the world's tallest mountain the Third Pole, and challenge it simply because it's there. But to Jerry Kobalenko, there is nothing simple about Ellesmere Island, a place he calls the horizontal Everest. Think of the little metal disc that sits on top of a globe. Ellesmere Island lies just under that, its northern shore only 700 kilometers from the North Pole. An island almost the size of Great Britain, but with an average annual temperature of minus 20 degrees Celsius and less than 20 centimeters of precipitation a year. For the most part, Ellesmere is a polar desert. On first glance, life seems impossible here. But nature has made a pact with Ellesmere, a devil's bargain. An incredible diversity of species have adapted to this unforgiving world of ice and snow, but they can't leave. Their unique metabolisms thrive in the cold, but would fail any further south. In the new lexicon of the North, we call these creatures extremophiles. And Jerry Kobalenko is one of them.
I've always enjoyed the cold. The air is like chilled champagne. It's just beautiful.
Every year for the past 15 years, Jerry's left family and friends behind to spend 4 months alone on Ellesmere Island. He hauls all he needs to survive on a single sled and has traveled over 6,000 kilometers, more than any other living Arctic explorer.
Top of the world.
Like all creatures capable of making Ellesmere their home, Jerry too has evolved here and forged a unique relationship with one of the last truly wild places on Earth.
I began here as a hard traveler. I just wanted to do distance, get from A to B as hard as possible, push physical limits. And then I became interested in wildlife and photography and lately history on the island. So in a way, I've become a hard traveling student of the island.
Oh, that hurts.
Most explorers live for a challenge, but Jerry's annual return to Ellesmere is inspired by dark mysteries. Clues to what happens when the human mind collides with the unforgiving realities of the North.
I just happened to be wandering the island and turned up a skull, a human skull. It was the only skull I'd ever seen up to that point. But more than that, this had a cut above the ear and it was clearly made from a sharp instrument coming down from above and from slightly behind. This guy was murdered centuries ago. So I just couldn't get out of my head the mystery behind his murder. And I think that was one of the first things that kept drawing me back to Ellesmere. The questions that some of these ghosts raise about what happened to them.
This man has become Jerry's latest obsession. Lieutenant Adolphus Greely, leader of a doomed expedition to Ellesmere in 1881. And Jerry has returned to solve the mystery of what went wrong. In the summer of 1881, Greely and 24 men set out to study the weather on Ellesmere Island. His team was composed of Army meteorologists, astronomers, and scientists, but no Arctic explorers. Only a few of the men could even row a boat. When their 2-year mission stretched to 3, their inexperience proved fatal. Few of the men would return alive. Greely's expedition is now considered one of the greatest disasters in Arctic history. And for Jerry, it is a mystery that begs to be solved. Why did they die, while he survives alone, year after year?
Following the footsteps of the old explorers, particularly when there was a tragedy, helps me understand people in dire straits, and that's very revealing. Greely captained a failed expedition where 19 died of 25. What happened to this guy?
Hugging the jagged edge of Ellesmere's east coast, Jerry travels north, following Greely's route to the place where this mystery begins. Greely's home for 2 years, Discovery Harbor. It is late spring on Ellesmere Island, and the ice is melting quickly. For Jerry Kobalenko, it's the best time of year to do some exploring. But then, he knows what he's doing. In 1881, Greely's expedition headed north along the coast by boat, seeking its new home base, Discovery Harbor.
Yeah, this is the end of the road.
This bleak coastline was to become home to 25 men for 2 years. Their ship arrived on August 13, 1881. Greely christened the site Fort Conger, named after one of his political allies back home in Washington. 18 tons of gear were unloaded, including 200 scientific instruments, 2,000 pounds of potatoes, and a plan.
Unlike most expeditions, they didn't keep their ship here. The ship went home, and they had arrangements for the ship to come back the following year to drop off some more supplies, and the year after that to pick them up.
They brought planks to build their quarters and used a wall of ice for insulation. Greely was the Army's top weatherman. He had his men collect data on weather every hour. Soon enough, they would experience Ellesmere's climate in their bones.
The sun disappears here in late October, and it doesn't rise till the 3rd week of February. It's quite common for it to be minus 58 or 59 Celsius. It was cold enough at Fort Conger one year that when some men put whiskey outside, it froze solid. And so a few of them had the chance to eat hard liquor.
Their heat came from coal, dug out of a natural seam 7 kilometers away. It was the main reason Greely was drawn to Discovery Harbor. Today, his stove is the largest artifact that remains.
This is Greely's stove. They ate their bacon, their bully beef, and their beans on this stove. But when the first explorers after Greely came and looked inside, they found human skulls. Greely plundered a lot of Inuit graves and put them in the stove for safekeeping before he left. In that time, anything like that was archaeological research. All the skulls are gone now, and all that's left inside is some fox droppings.
Evidence of the expedition litters the Fort Conger site. Artifacts are almost perfectly preserved in the dry Arctic air. But so far, there are no clues here to the tragedy that awaited Greely and his men.
Walking in the footsteps of the explorers helps me understand to what extent they were good travelers and to what extent they were just kind of bumbling about. One of them, Ellison, whom Greely described as one of my loyalist men, though not of the brightest, planted a vegetable garden. And he tried to encourage the seeds to grow in this cold climate by pouring boiling water over them. They didn't fare too well.
Greely knew his men would be happier with fresh meat than tinned beef, so the men searched the island for game. They discovered a strange menagerie of creatures who thrived in this barren landscape. Among them, the world's largest hare, the Arctic hare. Weighing in at 6 kilograms, it is cat-sized, but with a remarkable trick for escaping predators like the Arctic fox. Leaping upright allows them to reach speeds of up to 50 kilometers an hour, making them the fastest animal in the Arctic. Like many Arctic animals, this hare never hibernates, surviving winters by digging down to find food. Even stranger, they travel in herds, sometimes numbering in the thousands. For the Arctic hare, there's safety in numbers. But for explorers, danger's what it's all about. During the winter of 1882, Greely set aside science for dreams of glory. He ordered his men to head north to set new records in exploration. They returned frostbitten and snowblind. For Greely's generation, the Arctic was known as the Circle of Mysteries. No one knew what lay between here and the North Pole, so Greely sent his men to Greenland, where they set a new latitude record by 6 kilometers. But the Arctic's Mount Everest, the North Pole, would await this man, Commander Robert E. Peary, who claimed the pole a generation later.
When Peary came to Fort Conger, Greely had been gone for about 20 years, and he found this huge edifice that Greely had built. Peary called it this great barn of a place. He demolished it, and he built these 3 small cabins that he felt were much more efficient. He first reached Fort Conger in the middle of the winter, the polar night. He froze his toes. And here, at this very place, he had to have his doctor cut off 8 of those toes without anesthetic. He lay here in agony for months.
In Greely's day, the North Pole seemed impossibly distant. So when he decided to lead an exploration team of his own, he headed west into the uncharted interior of Ellesmere Island, a world no white man had ever seen, and a route never retraced until now. In the spring of 1882, Lieutenant Adolphus Greely led 4 men into the interior of Ellesmere Island. Now, Jerry Kovalenko retraces their path alone, searching for artifacts and answers.
Somebody said that the high Arctic is an empire where in the summer at least the sun never sets. I love the 24 hours of daylight that lets you go as hard as you want to for as long as you want to.
Greeley left the safety of Fort Conger and headed westward into completely uncharted territory. He found a glacier left over from the last ice age, 50 kilometers long and 10 wide. He named it Henrietta, after his wife. Greeley wrote to her constantly, "When I get back to you, have no fear that I will ever be willing to leave you again. One such separation is enough for a lifetime." Greeley's biggest discovery was a vast oasis in this polar desert. At 500 square kilometers, this is the largest lake in the high north. Greeley named it Lake Hazen, for a general he knew during the American Civil War. Even with 24 hours of sunlight a day, there is ice everywhere. Up here, there's a saying that white men think of ice as frozen water, but the Inuit think of water as melted ice. It is the Arctic's great shapeshifter. Here there is only one cardinal rule: never travel alone. Jerry's solitary style is unusual and risky.
I don't have a fear of dying alone or falling through ice. It's possible for anything to happen anywhere. It's possible to be walking on a sidewalk and get clipped by a car that jumps the curb. On my first expedition, I had a fall through the ice and it really shook me. My emergency transmitter didn't work, and it taught me that bringing gadgets like that along is very dangerous. And so since then I haven't taken any with me because I don't want to rely psychologically on anything but myself and my understanding of the land. As a walker, feet are absolutely the most important part of your body, and you have to treat them like they're gold. As long as you have your wheels, you can make tracks, but the minute the wheels fall off, you're in trouble.
Lake Hazen is a true oasis, surrounded by polar desert. The melting glacier brings new water each year. The open water attracts travelers like the snow goose, who has a one-track mind. Courtship is brief and direct here. There's no time to be coy. Families must get started quickly, before the ice returns. Greeley reached these shores in June of 1882. He found the lake teeming with butterflies and waterfowl. He came with 4 men and a cart packed with telescopes, sextants, and gear. It broke down somewhere near the lake. Now, 120 years later, Jerry wants to find it.
This side of Hazen has a face that only a mother could love, really. This is a polar desert, so you're not getting a lot of swamp. You will get tussocks at the foot of slopes caused by seepage in the permafrost. They're like walking on beach balls. It might have even been the sort of thing that broke down their cart eventually. It's one of those holy grails of the island, and I'd really like to find it.
Greeley's men dragged their cart 200 kilometers before its wheels finally fell off, but no one knows where. We do know that Greeley and his men celebrated the 4th of July with rum and lime by the water's edge. Jerry can't find the cart on the shore and decides to head into the surrounding hills to continue his search. The hills are home to one of nature's greatest explorers, the long-tailed yager. It migrates up to 15,000 kilometers to nest only here in the high Arctic. Greeley made notes on his next find, the wildflowers that explode on these hillsides for only a few weeks each year.
Greeley's journal at the Library of Congress, he talks about how everyone went through a brief flower craze when they were gathering flowers and pressing them to bring south. And sure enough, there were still dried flowers in Greeley's journal.
Any life here is a miracle. This polar desert receives less precipitation than the Great Sahara itself.
Well, 120 years later, the cart is obviously going to have changed from when Greeley left it. But this area is so dry, so cold, that it will not have rotted. The metal pieces of the wheel will be intact. There'll be a lot of old timbers that'll still be around.
Nothing, it seems, ever disappears on Ellesmere. Clues can last for centuries. Even the dead find it hard to hide.
I don't like this because it makes me feel like a shaman, and I'm not a shaman.
The muskox skull may be centuries old, a sign that the cart itself is still out there somewhere. And so Jerry presses on, certain that clues to Greeley's demise lie ahead. This skull will not be the last reminder of the life and death struggle that is Ellesmere Island. Jerry Kobalenko continues his search for Greeley's cart. He travels westward on Ellesmere Island and enters a terrain where hooves, not wheels, are the best way to get around. This shaggy creature is the muskox, perhaps the perfect extremophile. It is the island's largest land mammal. The Inuit named it Umingmak, or the bearded one. Its remarkable fur has two linings, allowing it to survive temperatures that plunge to -50 degrees Celsius. For this species, the Ice Age never ended.
Muskox really are Ice Age relics. Their prehistoric cave paintings come to life. They're contemporaries of the woolly mammoth and the saber-toothed tiger. When you look at them, you sometimes think they're just standing there patiently awaiting the next ice age.
To Greeley, the muskox were a miracle, easy to hunt and full of meat. His men killed 31 in a single month and then waited for winter to drag them back to camp. Jerry has spent years planning his search for Greeley's cart. But after 7 days scouring Lake Hazen, he's found no clue to Greeley's time here.
If you look for something up here, you tend not to find it. So it's not the finding of the cart. It's the quest for something that really drives me here.
But where did Greeley go next? Lake Hazen is vast, 500 square kilometers in size. The cart could be anywhere. When it broke down, Greeley carried on undaunted, and Jerry follows. He moves northwards, following Greeley towards Mount Barbeau in the United States range. Greeley's men were suffering now. Their feet hurt, some raw and bleeding from too much walking. 2 men were forced back to Fort Conger, while Greeley and the others forged on. Jerry follows them into an Ice Age landscape. No one knows if the glaciers of Ellesmere are the remains of the last great age of ice that ended 10,000 years ago. In fact, no one knows how many glaciers are on the island. There could be hundreds, but their power is undeniable. Like mammoth, slow-moving bulldozers, they scoured this landscape, leaving behind boulders the size of houses, scattered erratically on these flat, barren plateaus. And here they serve a unique purpose. The rocks trap the sun's heat. Plants take root and thrive on these small islands of warmth. To us, rocks are solid, but to moss, they are full of holes, filled with life-giving moisture. This boulder is like a greenhouse, heating up during the day and staying warm all night. It creates a microclimate, and often, even when there's snow on the ground, allows insects, like the caterpillar, to come alive. These are called woolly bears, another extremophile designed especially for survival in the cold.
Who'd imagine down south caterpillars crawling around in the snow? But if you watch these guys carefully, you see how they meticulously stick on black rocks where it's warm. So they not only have the chemistry, the natural antifreeze to survive here, but they're also smart in a simple way.
Jerry heads north into a mountain range buried in ice. Greeley never got this far, but Jerry can't resist the lure of a new challenge, even though climbing alone is risky. These mountains are called nunataks, and only the tips of their peaks are visible above 900 meters of ancient glacial ice. The most unique mountain of them all is Mount Barbeau, 150 kilometers west of Fort Conger. At 2,600 meters, it is the largest mountain in North America east of the Rockies. It's known as the Mecca of mountaineering. Everest may be tougher to climb, but there is no mountain in the world harder to reach than Mount Barbeau, and Jerry has never been here before. If he reaches the top, he will see more of Ellesmere Island in a minute than he has seen in 15 years.
I've always said that I go for high latitudes, not high altitudes. And here I'm both. And what a night, what a night.
Jerry reaches the summit at 2 in the morning, one of the first to climb it in the 21st century, and the only one to ever bring along a television camera. This haunting panorama has never been filmed before now.
From here, it's all downhill to the Rocky Mountains to the west, and all downhill to Mexico to the south. We're 8,700 feet at the top of the world. You just see this endless plain of white rolling on into forever with just a few little rocky peaks or nunataks sticking out of the sheet. It's a very austere world, strangely beckoning and also hostile at the same time.
From the summit of Mount Barbeau, Jerry can see the route Greeley and his men took to escape Ellesmere. For him, the mystery prevails. Why did so many of Greeley's men perish? And how can one man thrive while others are destroyed by the same ice world? Jerry Kobalenko heads south along the east coast of Ellesmere Island, following the Greely expedition's escape route. In the spring of 1883, their rescue ship fails to arrive. After 721 days alone, Greely orders his men into a ragtag flotilla of boats. They will head south through more than 400 kilometers of ice-choked waters. Their destination is a small outcrop of rock called Pym Island. "25 men, 40 days' food, and not a single sailor." Greely earns the men's hatred by making mistakes. The boats get trapped on an ice floe which drifts aimlessly for a month as their food runs dangerously low. One crewman writes of Greely, "This man, I cannot call him a gentleman, comes among us like a serpent in Eden and creates eternal hatred towards himself."
They thought their commander was insane, and in fact, there was a little bit of a conspiracy with the doctor and some others to have Greely declared insane. But what they didn't realize was that the supply ship was not blocked by ice, but that it had been caught in the ice and crushed like a walnut is crushed by a nutcracker. And so it was at the bottom of Kane Basin. There was nobody coming for them. Greely had no way of knowing this.
Incredibly, after a grim 59-day journey, they reached their destination safely, Pym Island, on Ellesmere's southeast coast. Ancient stones are thrown together to create a tiny makeshift shelter. Their roof is a tarpaulin, stretched over their last boat. 6 months of darkness lie ahead, and just 2 months of food.
There are 25 guys inside the stone wall under a tarpaulin, insulated with snow blocks. They had a scale that measured to the 16th of an ounce. So the guy next to you would not get one pea or one sliver of bully beef more than you.
They seem to have opened some of their tin cans anyway. The really old-fashioned way. They took a knife, and they cut across, and then they peeled back the corners.
Now, with only a month of daylight remaining, Greely orders his men to find food anywhere they can. Most look for supplies left by other expeditions, with little luck. The ice begins to clog the waters. The strongest take rifles and look for anything to kill. In a region with names like Thank God Harbor and Lifeboat Cove, no one gives this place a hopeful name. There is food here. One soldier builds a net to catch shrimp-like creatures. They become a staple of their meager diet. But just one day's walk away, there is an answer to their prayers. This is a polynya. Strong tidal currents keep this water open all year, creating a magnet for game on an island where no creature ever hibernates.
Definitely something you don't want to do at 40 below. 40 below kayaking. It's what adventurers who haven't been nice to their mothers are sentenced to in hell.
Here, kayakers tend to be very conservative because if anything happens, you're basically dead.
Polynias are the true oases of the Arctic. Walrus congregate here in herds, and just a few of these massive mammals could have supplied Greely's men with enough meat and blubber to survive all winter. But they're also dangerous. Able hunters, they eat seals.
In a kayak, walrus are really the only danger. Walrus are in fact the most dangerous animal in the Arctic. Their heads are just huge and their eyes are big and bloodshot, and they just stare at you and you're just kind of wondering what they think.
They're also very clever, using their tusks to haul their huge weight onto ice floes. Weighing in at over a ton, they're strong enough to flip any boat or kayak that comes near.
The explorers told stories of walrus taking a man between his flippers and sucking all the flesh off his face like they do with clams.
This Polynia could have fed Greely's men for months, and yet they never found it. Just a day's walk from their camp. Polynias attract every kind of creature. The tempering warmth of open water even helps keep the surrounding hills clear of snow, allowing muskox to feed here as well.
There are so many muskox not far away that a much more competent explorer who came 15 years later established hunting camps not far from this area. So had Greely come here and worked this area a little bit more, it's very likely they would all have survived.
Greely, it seems, had more faith in men than nature. Now desperate, he orders his men to find any food left by previous expeditions, no matter how far away. In the end, his tragic mistakes would cost the lives of 19 men. Spring at the Polynia on southeastern Ellesmere Island. Dozens of species begin to gather here, rejoicing in the new warmth. This smorgasbord of wildlife was ignored by the ill-fated Greely expedition. No animal here need fear their rifles. The hunters were too weak to leave their camp, even to save their own lives.
Greely expected to be rescued, and so their thought was, okay, we have a certain amount of food, let's try to stretch it out. They would have been much better served by coming in here and hunting the seals or hunting the walrus that would be around the Polynia. But they didn't understand the place. They had no idea this inner bay was so rich, and they starved to death. It was really a one-day walk from here.
By the spring of 1884, none of the men is strong enough to walk for more than an hour or two. This lonesome cove had become their prison. A few animals wander within rifle range of the camp, but it's too little, too late.
Greely's Camp Clay is the most haunted place I've ever seen.
Sealskin pants are boiled and eaten. Greely, like most of the men, is too weak to even get out of his sleeping bag. And when a man dies of starvation, he's kept in Greely's bag until he becomes too cold. delirium seizes the men, and food theft is common. Ultimately, Greeley is forced to execute a Private Henry for stealing only a few mouthfuls of food. Three weeks later, on June 22, 1884, the rescue ship arrives. Its captain doubts that anyone could have survived a third winter without new supplies, and he prepares for the worst. They find only 6 men left. 19 have died. Miraculously, Greeley himself has survived by sheer force of will. The emaciated survivors are brought on board ship. So are the dead, and here the crew discovers an awful secret. Some of the bodies seem to have been sliced up for food. Greeley denies any knowledge, and so did the rest of his men. At home, news headlines call it the shame of the nation. But Greeley himself is promoted to brigadier general. In the end, he never returns to the Arctic and dies in 1935 at the venerable age of 91. After 3 years of scientific study on Ellesmere Island, Greeley never did learn the Arctic's singular lesson. Life survives here only by adapting and becoming part of the Arctic, thriving on its extreme conditions. Humility is the only rule. Those who disobey disappear. But unlike many who came before him, Jerry Kovalenko has adapted. He too is an extremophile and has made this his own personal Everest. And unlike Greeley, he keeps coming back.
I try to take what the Arctic throws at me in stride. You feel not that you have conquered the land, but that the place has allowed you to travel through it. My worst fear is the day I come here and I find I no longer enjoy it. Eventually you reach the age when this sort of travel is too hard a life for you. That's the thing that I'm most afraid of.
The nameless skull that inspires Jerry Kovalenko to return again and again to his mountain of an island rests on a carpet of lush green moss. Nitrogen is in short supply in the lean Arctic topsoil, and here the land itself literally sucks it out of the bone. On Ellesmere, death always nourishes life. It is nature's great mystery.